You're listening to Virtual Sentiments. I'm Kristen Collins, and on today's episode, we begin our second season talking to my colleague, Dr. Christopher Coyne. He is the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, as well as a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Chris and I discuss one of our shared research interests, surveillance. Surveillance can be practiced by states and governments, collecting information about individuals, using that information to police, control, and influence individuals. But surveillance can also refer to practices by everyday citizens, watching and judging, influencing each other, and also private firms. Surveillance is particularly discussed in terms of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, referring to business practices by mostly technology companies where they use data collected just in sort of the normal operations of their services or products. And rather than just using that data to improve their products and services, the user's experience, they seek profit from this data, either selling or also potentially just using the data, promising clients the ability to, because they have access to that data, target individuals and shape their behavior for them. So we'll talk about both those types of surveillance throughout this conversation, but we'll also talk about kind of broader conversations around the importance of interdisciplinary dialogue. We come at these topics from different perspectives. Chris is an economist. I am a political theorist. And so as a result, we have kind of different ways of thinking about these issues. Something that might look to an economist as settling an issue of information asymmetry might look to a political theorist as something that's a major transformation of how we relate to each other, how we use and rely on products that we purchase in a market setting, and also kind of the cultural norms that we have as a society. So, these are important conversations to be having in a broader sense, getting various perspectives on them. And so I hope in this spirit, you all appreciate this episode and coming at these conversations from different perspectives, talking together about state and non-state forms of surveillance. So thank you so much for chatting with us today, Chris.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm really excited about this conversation for a lot of reasons, but I do want to situate the conversation in terms of your broader research agenda, because I think that's important for kind of understanding where you're coming from and sort of the idea that surveillance is a very broad topic. So we kind of want to be clear about what our focus is today. And so one of the reasons why I'm excited about this conversation is when I first started doing work with Mercatus when I was a PhD student in our Adam Smith Fellowship, you were my discussion leader, as you may or may not remember. And one of the reasons, a lot of people have different preconceived notions when they first start a new program like that. And what I was really struck by, and something that made me really comfortable in our very interdisciplinary discussion sessions and things like that, was that knowing that you, even though you're an economist, have very in-depth and interdisciplinary work in international relations, foreign policy, national security issues, and you were very open to, discussing not just the technical sides of these topics and the sort of theoretical underpinnings, but also the normative implications, which I think, is sometimes something that in academia and trying to get conceptual clarity or sharp analysis, we can sometimes set aside the idea of, what these issues really are talking about are violence, making lives better for people, and then that desire to see peace and to see flourishing around the world, but just how horribly these things can go wrong and the sort of injustices throughout history that we've seen and how to make sense of them and how to avoid them in the future. So I just, I want to thank you for being somebody who is interested in those topics and so willing to have those types of conversations, but also I wanted to ask sort of how did you as an economist come to work on these topics and to do so in this more interdisciplinary, nuanced way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that. I, of course, remember your group quite well in Smith. And it's flattering to hear, not just personally, but also because that's the purpose of that program, to have those interdisciplinary conversations. And also, of course, for us to be part of it, the faculty, but to learn, not just to be a scholar, but to interact and learn. And so it's a great opportunity to do that. And in terms of the research program, the research program actually started very early in my graduate career at George Mason University, which is where I went for my graduate education. And of course, one of the unique parts of the Department of Economics at George Mason is it's highly interdisciplinary and open to students pursuing interdisciplinary topics that many economists might consider outside their narrow purview, and certainly approaching those interdisciplinary topics using an interdisciplinary toolkit. But my third week in graduate school was the 9/11 attacks. I had just come from New York City, and actually I worked down in the Wall Street area right by the World Trade Centers, and I went to school in New York City and grew up right around there. So I had that connection. And then, of course, the 9/11 attacks hit also the Pentagon, not far from the Fairfax campus at George Mason, where I was going to school. And then soon after that, of course, the United States government starts the war on terror, invades Afghanistan and Iraq. And my dissertation was actually on nation building, on the ability of foreign occupiers to export liberal democratic institutions using the tools of political economy. And then from there, I worked on a project on humanitarian aid, another book. And those books were kind of focused on the feasibility of intervention abroad. And then I started shifting my focus domestically. And one of the really big influences on me, in addition to just reading scholarly, but in terms of scholarly work, but in terms of contemporary news stories, was the Edward Snowden revelations. When those happened, I just started reading about the US surveillance state. And I knew it existed. I knew bits and pieces of it, but I really didn't have an in-depth understanding of the breadth of the apparatus or its history and how far back it went in US history. And then that kind of set me on a path, along with my co-author of a book called Tyranny Comes Home, Abby Hall. She is a former graduate of our PhD program, and now she's a professor at Tampa, University of Tampa, in the Department of Economics, to kind of explore how intervening abroad can return home and undermine liberties and freedoms at home, which in many ways undermines the stated purpose of the intervention, which is almost always to protect domestic liberties and freedoms while also promoting those values abroad. And so that was my entry point to consider the issues that we considered there, and I've been studying since.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I appreciate you sharing the sort of personal side of also the inspiration behind, or being shaped by events like 9/11 and also Edward Snowden's revelations about the NSA, which I think is also like, I don't think I've shared this in the podcast before, but I remember a scholar visited a class of mine in grad school, and she said, work on what makes you angry. And I think, it's interesting because a lot of, and again, there's an academic expectation of objectivity and neutrality, and not that isn't feasible and valuable, but I also think, in order to do a lot of this work and to be as curious and passionate as we are to, make some trade-offs in terms of how much money we might make working outside of academia, things like that, various other concerns, you're going to be working on stuff that is somewhat personal to you. So I appreciate that. And yeah, so I wanted to zero in on that, like you were saying about the sort of broader history of surveillance, because that is something that you and Abigail Hall talk about in Tyranny Comes Home. You kind of contextualize, you really build out that argument you just talked about, which is the idea that our foreign interventions abroad, which are, again, like you said, are often done purportedly in service of protecting Americans and their values and spreading the same values of liberal democracy abroad, but how intervening and occupying other countries, the American government forces will develop methods of social control that then kind of boomerang back into American politics. So I kind of wanted to zero in on one of those cases, for our conversation, which is surveillance. So I was hoping you could maybe just give us a little bit more insight into kind of why should we think of surveillance as a phenomenon that occurs throughout history and kind of trace its history in American politics, including in the American occupation of the Philippines, for example, which is something that you guys talk about. And then also in the 50s and 60s, 70s of the various FBI programs, such as COINTELPRO, and just sort of give us a sense of, what should this history kind of help us think about for thinking about surveillance today?
Yeah. So starting very broadly before we get to the surveillance state, I think it's important to think about what foreign intervention entails and what intervening in other societies to bring about some preconceived end, even if that end is perhaps noble in its intentions or benevolent in its intentions, what it ultimately involves, which is discretion on the part of a group of, I'll call them political elite in the intervening country, coming up with a plan of both how another society should look and then the means to achieve that end. And that requires ultimately force or the threat thereof, because you really have two options. You say, look, I'm unhappy with the status quo, so I want change. You can ask people to voluntarily change. They might. But if they don't, you have two options at that point. You can either withdraw, that is, not intervene, or you can intervene and use force to replace voluntary compliance. And we should never forget that ultimately that is at the core of intervening into a society to bring about some desirable end. The reason that's important is because you can't avoid carrying out an intervention without all of the complementary kind of structure or infrastructure that is necessary to do that. And part of that is human capital. By human capital, I mean the skills and knowledge that is required of both the plan you want to accomplish, but also the means to control people to bring it about. And also physical capital. So the tools that are necessary in order to aid you in your intervention. So that requires a government that plans to intervene to invest in those things on the front end and to kind of develop those skills and technologies. Then you intervene and then you say, well, okay, well, that's taking place over there. How does it end up coming back? Well, there's a couple kind of channels that Abby and I talk about in the book where it can come back. One is that the human capital, the skills that the people develop. So when people are done abroad, they oftentimes return home. And, many people just return to their normal life. They can have a normal job in the government, perhaps, or some return to civilian life. And, they don't change the fabric of domestic life in any kind of concrete way. But others return home and enter into leadership positions in government, or many of them start private contracting firms. And then they partner with the military sector domestically. And like any industry, they leverage their human capital to earn a wage. Like any of us, we build up skills and we work in those areas where we have skills because we earn a living, we have a network. It's part of our identity as a laborer and as a person. In addition, the physical capital that is developed can also return home and be used for domestic matters. The other important aspect, I think, of the post 9/11 world is that there was a very unique aspect to it where the battlefield was the entire globe. The war on terror, much like the war on drugs, is a open-ended war with, it's unclear what victory would look like. I mean, terror is a psychological state. It's a fear. So that's existed throughout human history. So it's unclear what defeating terrorism would look like. You can defeat certain people you classify as terrorists, perhaps, but that's not eradicating terrorism as a phenomena. But in any case, what that did, broadening the battlefield to the entire globe, was to include America, include domestic soil. And also, because a terrorist can be anyone, it's not someone who wears a uniform and identifies with a particular set of armed forces. All of us are potential terrorists. And so you have the entire expanse of the globe combined with everyone being a potential suspect. And that opened the door for massive expansions in both the scale and scope of government control over people's lives. So that's kind of the broad foundation of the conversation that Abby and I engage in. And then you turn to surveillance, in particular with the United States. And it does go back to the earliest we could trace it back in any kind of systematic way was to the Philippine-American War, as you mentioned. And of course, during that period, America takes control of the Philippines. Originally, they were going to grant them independence, but they say, no, we're not actually going to grant you independence. Of course, that rightfully agitated people living in the Philippines, leads to an insurgency. And again, at that point, the United States government had the option of either withdrawing or pushing back against the insurgency. And of course, they pushed back against the insurgency. And the really fascinating part about that war was it was one of the first instances, certainly in American history, where beyond utilizing standard violent techniques to combat insurgents, there was a systematic effort to collect data on the insurgency. Now, of course, by today's standards, these would be quite rudimentary things. It would be like information about people's finances, about their personal lives, their religion, their sex lives, their social networks. And the reason this was collected was to utilize as a weapon against people, to manipulate people and threaten people and shape outcomes to comport with the goals of the interveners. The person at the core of this is someone named Ralph Van Diemen, who very few people know about in American history, but he's actually quite famous for people in studying intelligence. His kind of moniker is he's the father of U.S. military intelligence. He's a member of the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. There's such a thing. I didn't know there was such a thing, but there is.
And wait, I'm sorry. Is that like a positive thing, or?
Well, it's meant as a positive thing. Yep. I guess if you make a groundbreaking contribution to military intelligence, you too can be a Hall of Famer. He headed up something in the Philippines called the U.S. Army Division of Military Information. That was the name of the division. He collected all this information, and this is over about a 3-year period. So I think 1899 to 1902 approximately, and then he comes back in 1902. And so he comes back with these kind of skills, but also this vision he had developed about the efficiency of collecting information on people as a tool to control them. And he has an unpublished memoir, which is available online. And he's pretty clear in there that he says, I wanted to establish something analogous to this agency domestically, but it didn't get a lot of traction at first. And so he was in government, kicking around in all different kind of jobs, nothing earth shattering. But then World War I happens. And this opens the door for a broader acceptance for the collection of information domestically in order to thwart people who were pushing back against the war effort. And so I think it's in 1917, Van Diemen establishes what's called the Military Intelligence Section. And he was the head. It was a very small group, by the way, so it's not like the NSA today. But this would eventually become the NSA. So it's a very small group, and they were collecting information, again, very rudimentary by today's terms, communications over wires, information through the mail, tracking finances on people that were viewed as being subversive to the U.S. war effort and in kind U.S. national security, or so the argument went. Completely, or for the most part, unconstrained. There's not like there's any judicial oversight or congressional oversight of this, by the way. And then like many government agencies, there's reorganization and rebranding from here. So you go from the military intelligence section to signal intelligence services in the late 20s or around 1930, I think. Signal Security Agency gets rebranded about 10 years later. The Armed Forces Security Agency is the next iteration. And then the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is created in 1952. I think that's the same year that Van Diemen passed away, by the way, was 1952. And as Abby and I discuss in Tyranny Comes Home, that the establishment of that agency was really the full maturation of Van Diemen's vision. And, one other side note on Van Diemen, which is kind of fascinating, especially with the discussion today with former President Trump and all the papers. Van Diemen was a meticulous data collector. And so when he passed away, I think it was an apartment, might have been a house, had literally hundreds of thousands of index cards and random pieces of data that he had collected on hundreds of thousands of different people. And there was all these debates about what to do with this because it was like considered top secret national security stuff. But it's just kind of fascinating. And he was known as being this kind of person that was quite meticulous with collecting data, but also ruthless in using it to kind of control people. So that was the foundations of what we know as the NSA today. Again, it started in some sense in a very innocuous fashion. It was this small little group of people, And you can see back in 1917, if you had asked probably, and I don't have any survey data on this, but you can see why if you had said to people, well, do you think it's okay to have 10 people collecting information on people that might do bad stuff to Americans or to the, stability of American institutions? They'd say, oh, yeah, nothing, that's not a major thing. What harm can they do? And just, less than 40 years later, you have the NSA. And of course, today, the NSA is an enormous entity. So then that leads us up to how do we know about how the NSA operates, and not just the NSA, I should say, but the rest of the security establishment, so the CIA and the FBI. And as you mentioned in your opening comments to this part of the conversation, in the 60s into the 70s, it became evident through reporting of Seymour Hersh, through what's known as the CIA Family Jewels, which was a series of kind of, at the time, top secret papers about the activities of the CIA, that the CIA had been violating their charter, that they had been operating on domestic soil, collecting information about private citizens, members of Congress, which is, they're not supposed to be operating domestically. And the revelation of this led to a massive kind of uprising, if you will, among many people in the United States, not just private citizens, but also members of civil rights groups, but also members of Congress. Because they were among the people being surveilled, which of course they don't like. They like surveilling others, but not being surveilled. And so this led to a series of congressional investigations. There was something called the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, Democrat, I think from Idaho. He was one of the ones who was being surveilled, by the way. And this led to the revelation of just the enormous breadth of what was going on. And so what you had was something called Project Shamrock that had been carried out by the NSA, but had gone back before 1952. It had started in 1945, I think, under the Signal Security Agency, and then continued when the NSA was established. And what Project Shamrock was doing was monitoring every telegraph that was coming in and out of the United States. So they had access to all telegraphs coming in and out, without, again, any kind of warrant, any kind of oversight. So they could access people's communications, ordinary citizens, with no one even knowing they were doing it. The FBI, as you mentioned, with COINTELPRO, which was both the surveillance, but also the manipulation of both U.S. citizens, political organizations, nonprofits who were involved in a whole host of activities, from civil rights to anti-war movements to certain political ideologies that were considered to be inappropriate from the perspective of the political elite. So communism, socialism, and so on. And it wasn't just collecting data, even though they would do that. They were breaking and entering into people's private property to collect things. They were manipulating people's private property in order to set them up, to punish them in various ways. And so that was the FBI. The CIA was engaged in something called Project Chaos. And Project Chaos was an effort to monitor people who were on a list. So there was a watch list that was put together by the CIA, not publicly published, of course, but people that were considered to be potentially subversive to the American system. And so the CIA was also collecting information that was on domestic soil. And then the final one, a key project here, was what's called Project Minaret, which was the NSA as well. And they also were collecting watch lists, coordinating across government agencies. So they were sharing information with the FBI and the CIA. So you had massive collusion across these agencies. And, the Church Committee report, it's all available online. It's multiple volumes. Very few people even know about it. But it's pretty explicit in what they say, which is, these agencies were acting as if we lived under a totalitarian regime. And this is their language. They say things like the behavior of these segments of our government are much more aligned to what we'd expect in a totalitarian regime than in a democratic regime. And they talk about how basically every aspect of American life was subject in various ways to surveillance and control. Frank Church, who I mentioned before, headed up the committee. He was a senator. He went on, and I'm sure this is available somewhere on YouTube or whatever, but I think it's like Meet the Press or something. And he goes online in the mid 70s, one of the talk shows, the weekend talk, political talk shows, and they're interviewing him. And he says, look, this is 1975, remember. He says, the breadth of this is so enormous that if a dictator took over this country, there'd be no place for Americans to hide. They could collect information on you and know what you were doing, and there'd be no way for citizens to push back because they would be able to follow you wherever you're going. And that's 1975. So it's not like the kind of technological advances that exist today, which is very troubling in itself. So that was the foundations, and we're up to what, 1975 at that point. And then what you get out of that is something called the FISA court. The FISA court was the court that was supposed to be the congressional solution to this. And so it's a court that was set up that is called non-adversarial. It's non-adversarial because the people that are being monitored don't have knowledge that they're being monitored and don't have the right to represent themselves. And you understand why, right? If they're surveilling you or I because they're worried about us, they don't want us to know we're being surveilled because we'll change our behavior. So the argument goes. So this is a secret court that is supposed to monitor surveillance collection. And when the government collects data on a citizen, it's supposed to get pre-approval from this court. And the court has a very high approval rate, which has been interpreted in one of two ways. And I'll let listeners decide which one is right. One is that it's extremely effective. So one argument is that it's extremely effective such that the government will only bring cases before it for approval that they know are going to go through because they're such strong, upholders of the law. The flip side, kind of counter argument and perhaps more cynical argument, which still might be correct, but is that it's basically a rubber stamp and that they don't really deny government. So it's kind of a facade of the rule of law, but not really.
Yeah, no, and this brings up, that's an excellent detailed overview of the relevant histories and institutions. And what I wanted to say, what is also, I think, striking and sort of an influence for me, and then I think also, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the reasons why your work resonates with me and why I think some of its major strengths lie in the fact that we often kind of, including in academia, we often kind of treat very differently liberal democracies from authoritarian or autocratic regimes. And I've had students who complain about that tendency to do that because, they know American history and they've even, experienced things in their lives that suggest like, okay, these institutions that are supposed to be and political practices in the U.S., which are supposed to be liberal, supposed to be democratic, have actually been used to perpetuate various forms of oppression, like these surveillance programs against, again, supposedly subversive people. And so I guess what I wanted to ask is, and that doesn't mean that there aren't major institutional differences, of course, between different types of regimes, but one thing that somebody might be thinking when they hear about this, if they haven't thought that much about this, is, well, what about constitutional constraints? What about the amendments to the Constitution that are supposed to protect things, protect our privacy and various freedoms in that way? And I think something you guys kind of talk a little bit about is how, to the extent that there's been instances in history where the judicial system kind of sides on the side of the government as opposed to civil liberties, partly because of things like whenever national security is on the table or in the context of wartime. There's actually a good book, I think you've also familiar with Mary Dudziak's book, Wartime, and sort of the way that wartime is kind of constructed and developed and then ends up enabling these various kind of violations of the constitutional constraints that we do have. So I guess could you speak a little bit to that and sort of how you think of the idea that there are, again, like sort of institutional checks, and yet those, where do we see those falling away and not working the way we want them to?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that book, by the way, that you mentioned, Wartime, I like it very much. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. I think that in order to think about this, again, it's where we start our conversation with the interdisciplinary aspect of it, because you have to traverse, I think, several disciplines. And really, economics takes a backseat, I think, to these, at least the starting point for these issues. It comes in, I think, in terms of incentives facing actors once you think of the constraints. But you have to step back for a moment and think about kind of the core problem. And the way I think about it, and feel free to jump in and if you think I'm off or if there's an aspect I'm missing, is something like this. All governments have the ability in principle to do things that are beneficial to people or harmful to people. So that's hopefully not a controversial statement, but it's like a starting premise. And the challenge then, this is, of course, what some people call like the paradox of government. Any government that is strong enough to protect your person and property is also strong enough to violate the very things it's supposed to protect. And that really comes to a head in matters of national security. And that poses a huge challenge for legal scholars, for political scientists who are doing applied work, for political scientists that are doing conceptual work and thinking about, what is the state? What is the state supposed to look like? How can we structure it? All these type of issues. And many people have talked about this across disciplines and throughout history. And so the normal solution to that is a constitution. You have constitutional rules that empower government to do the good stuff and prevent it from doing the bad stuff by raising the cost of people in positions of power from doing bad stuff. Okay, that makes sense. But then you have to take the next step and say, how are we going to operationalize this? So how's it going to work in practice? And the challenge in some sense is that ultimately all of these things are operationalized involving human beings, whether they're carrying out the acts or interpreting the acts, whether it's the courts interpreting the acts. And then it really collapses in an interesting way into ideological views. So what ideology does the court hold, for instance, about the relationship between the citizen and the state in matters of national security, especially when there's a crisis situation? What relationship is there at any point in time between the citizen and what citizens expect of their government during times of a crisis or emergency situation? And then what is the power of the different branches of government? So is for instance, in the American context, is Congress doing their job in declaring war? Or do we have, the idea of the imperial presidency, where an enormous amount of power through time has been concentrated in the hands of the executive in the name of protecting person and property. And people will say, well, that's their job as commander in chief. That's exactly what you want, a strong leader, and they can't be tied down by constitutional constraints. And that's a huge part of the debate. And I think one of the things that we see through history, but something that kind of building on the last part of our conversation where we left off with the FISA court and what became very clear during the post 9/11 period, is that many of these rules or constraints, at least as they exist right now in America, are kind of parchment speed bumps. And you look at something like the FISA court, and now we know because of the revelations that the Bush administration just issued an executive order that said, you don't have to do that anymore. Very much like with torture, it's like, this is not torture. So here I wrote a memo that defines it not as torture. Is that how you define torture? But if you can write a memo or just issue an executive order that says, no, the rules don't apply to me, then they're not rules. They have no teeth. The cost is you having a lawyer write a memo for you. And that's the challenge. And throughout U.S. history, certainly post World War II, but I think you can even go back before then, courts have granted a significant amount of space to the national security state to do their thing. And, interestingly, people from across the ideological spectrum take very different positions on this. So it's not like a clear, and what I mean by that is you'll find people who are on the left who sometimes they're very comfortable with government having expansive powers. Others are very worried about it. More in the right, the same way on the right. Kind of liberals in the classical tradition, even there you see huge debate, like among limited government people. Some of them are quite strong and they'll say, well, limited government except when it comes to national security and war making. And that's, in much of my work, that's one of my targets, because I'm always quite concerned, or I see great problems in that position and tensions. And that's one of my targets of the kind of intellectuals I'm trying to engage in that. So
no, and I think that makes sense. And I think those are important. And I feel like a lot of millennials, and of course, people are going to have like different political backgrounds and stuff. But I'm just speaking like as a millennial, like 9/11 was obviously, I think, a defining time. And so to kind of come of age politically and see all the arguments being made for war, especially in the Iraq War too, and often it being, again, as we kind of started the conversation with, about used in service of, well, this is what freedom requires of us. And I actually, there's sort of this increasing rhetoric, and it's different. The discussions are a little bit different, but sort of debates around masculinity or manliness today. And some of that stuff is very evocative of sort of conversations throughout the history of political thought of this idea of, the need for like a martial virtues or martial spirit to kind of protect our modern life, and that's sort of what's at loss. And so I think the sort of, I don't know, I think there's sort of this need to be able to confront and discuss and show all the different effects of things like military intervention that, you know, as much as people want to kind of also, I think, put American power out there, kind of showing how it changes domestic policies, undermines domestic principles and liberties. I don't know. I just feel like that's a very definitive and important thing for us to be confronting. Something that I try to talk about when talking about Tyranny Comes Home is also, or even just actually in general, whenever you're talking with people about surveillance and privacy, it's often this phrasing that there's this trade-off or, you know, sort of relationship between security and liberty, that we need to be willing to make some sacrifices in order to have a secure polity, or even that like liberty really does depend on security. So, this is also like the same type of thing of, you know, if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. So how do you think that there is that kind of relationship between security and liberty, that somehow there's a zero-sum relationship where, you know, you need to be willing to sacrifice liberty to have security, and that security is necessary to enjoy other, you know, liberty overall?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And you know, I should note it's not just citizens that believe that. There's a strand of literature, mainly in legal studies, that explores this. And so there's a book titled Terror in the Balance, which is by Adrian Vermeule and I think Richard Posner is the other co-author. And they are two very famous legal scholars. And in that book, Terror in the Balance, they are analyzing the George W. Bush administration response to the war on terror. And they are quite supportive of it. And their logic is very much in line with what you opened with, which is their model is what they call this trade-off model. And so they actually have like the equivalent of like a PPF. They have like security and liberty on the two axes. And then it's like you just move up and down. So they say like, look, you're up here during times of non-crisis. So you have more liberty, less security. And then the emergency comes and you move down the PPF. So you're trading off liberty, but you're getting more security. And they are, going back to our earlier comments we were just making a few moments ago, they are staunch supporters of concentrated power in the hands of the executive. They say, look, this is an emergency situation. The foundations of our society are a threat. You cannot be held down by constitutional rules. You just can't because of the crisis. So you get the movement down. And then they say, well, look, the civil libertarians say that the government's going to grab power and steal your liberties. And they say, don't fret, because we have Congress and the judiciary. So after the crisis ends, we have these checks in place. The judiciary will interpret the Constitution, Congress will legislate, and you'll move back up the PPF kind of to the optimal point on there so you get the right bundle. And I'm not a fan of this argument. And it's not a first principles response. My response isn't based in first principles like, oh, it's a rights violation, so therefore it's bad. I think practically it's a very problematic argument. And on the one hand, even if we take their model as given, I think it raises issue because of various political frictions and pathologies in politics. The reason I raise that is I don't think it's nearly the process is as smooth as they suggest. On the front end, meaning a step one being the taking of liberties and provision of security, I don't think is nearly as smooth as moving up and down a PPF, because that presumes those categories are well defined and explicit and ex ante known. And then you take into account the kind of logistics of the operation of Congress and the judiciary. And I'm not confident you're going to get that smooth move back to the optimal amount. Number one, because I don't know what it means to have an optimal amount of security for society, as if you could know what that, 10 people sitting in a room could know what that means. And then second of all, when you take into account the incentives of democratic politics. But then the other issue, I think, is with the categories themselves. And so I view security as more of a multifaceted, having multiple margins. And here's what I mean by that. You could say like, okay, we're going to provide you more security against terrorism. And let's pretend for a moment we actually do that. And I'll come back to that pretending point in a moment. You're still trading off security on other margins, because if government can surveil you, and you appreciate that there's at least some potential for them to do bad with that power, either in the present or the future, then you might become more secure on one margin and simultaneously less secure on another margin. And those are just two. We could add more margins. And then the pretending point is that it's unclear to me that you're actually made more safe from terrorism in this case. You can make the argument. It's very hard to empirically measure or test this, mainly because of the counterfactual. You can make the argument that the world is less safe from terrorism because of the war on terror. And certainly we saw increases in instances of terrorism in places where the United States occupied. That's an empirical fact. And that often happens when there's occupations because people have no other way of expressing their voice and displeasure because you can't do it through the normal political channels. And again, you can say, like, please leave, but the occupiers aren't going to leave. But then you have the whole thing about the creating future generations of terrorists because of occupiers, because of the systematic use of drones, and so on. And we won't know the full extent of that for decades, if we ever do, because tracing it back to those actions years and decades earlier is quite difficult. So when you take this into account, I'm quite skeptical of that framing of the situation, both at a purely conceptual level, but also in terms of a useful framework for operationalizing policy and for thinking about how we might implement that policy.
Yeah, no, I think that really makes a lot of sense to me, and I think you put it very well. And it's funny. I once upon a time I figured out the right sort of economics language to talk about that theory of liberty and security, but so I'm glad we could have you explain it, not me, because I couldn't quite get it out. But yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I think when I TA'd intro to theory classes and we talked about Hannah Arendt, and we about totalitarianism and various 20th century totalitarianism. I mean, that really hammers home for you and various historical instances of this, where the rise of sort of arbitrary discretion and sort of invasive policies that are again done in the name of security are really making you fundamentally live a much more insecure life as an individual. Even just talking about, in the domestic context. And then there can also be ways in which there's also discriminatory, of course, application of laws that then make some people even more insecure and oppressed than others. So it's interesting. I think that people sometimes criticize liberals as being not concerned enough with this sort of basic, political order that is required of any community in order to enjoy freedoms. But I actually think that the liberal kind of understanding, at least, and there's also other ways of kind of criticizing liberalism too. But I think the sort of liberal response is really, well, actually having this certain kind of checks on power and certain protected liberties are really fundamental to enabling an order, rather than putting people into insecure relations with each other and with the state overall. So I think that liberty, I guess this is just to say that I do think that liberty can be conducive to a sense of security, and sort of it doesn't have to be this sort of oppositional relationship that is supposed.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's an important point. I'm glad you raised it.
Yeah. And so the other thing that I kind of wanted to kind of get in a little bit before, because I did want to make sure we talked about sort of your ongoing work also with comparative institutional analysis and comparing kind of surveillance in sort of a market context in these business practices I mentioned earlier, but then also versus kind of state surveillance programs. But before moving on to that, I kind of did also want to, or sort of, I guess, as a way of transitioning, is ask your kind of thoughts on how we think about technological developments. So some of of course, the history you were explaining from sort of the occupation of the Philippines to American domestic surveillance, and then the war on terror and American domestic surveillance. That in that period of time, there's just like major technological developments. And so how do you think we should think about the role of technology? Because on the one hand, the state is able to collect, a lot of information via new technological forms of communication technologies. But then at the same time, we don't necessarily want to become kind of technologically, like have this sort of technological determinism that because there's all these new technologies that by necessarily meant that these types of programs were going to be implemented because they could be.
Yeah, I follow what you're saying. It's a great point. And so the way I view technological advances is neither good nor bad. So I like technological advances just because I think it can improve human well-being. But any piece of technology at any point in history, even the most rudimentary technology, can be used for good or bad. This is where I think the comparative institutional analysis comes in. So then that forces us, I think, as social scientists and as analysts to think about how is it being used and what are the potential consequences for that, good or bad. And so certainly you're right that just because technology has advanced and can advance doesn't mean it will be used in nefarious ways, doesn't mean it will be used to control people, but it can. And so then we have to think about how it has been used, how it might be used, but also the various checks and balances. I don't necessarily even mean codify like in a constitution. It can be institutional structures, because as we're going to talk about in a moment, one of the big concerns is that even in a purely market setting, technological advances can be used to impose real harms on ordinary people, which is a real concern. So I get the foundation of the concern people have.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get a little bit more deeply into sort of this comparative institutional analysis. So for those who might not be familiar with this sort of approach that you and your co-authors take, kind of what does it mean to be kind of comparing and contrasting the sort of surveillance in a state context versus in a private context?
Yeah, so this is a project I should mention with a few co-authors, Abby Hall, who I mentioned before, Matthew Owens, and Yael Shami. So I should give them all a shout out for their work on this with me. And this grew out of our really everything we've been talking about, just my interest in surveillance and reading and having conversations with you now for a couple of years about these issues of different manifestations of surveillance and the fact that, although we've been talking and I've focused historically on the political aspect, that's not the only place where surveillance can come about. And you've talked about this in your own work, and I certainly influenced broadening the way I think about it as well. And so to get at this, the way, first of all, let's start broadly, which is what's comparative institutional analysis. Maybe that's where to start, and then we can apply it. The way I think about it is as follows, and it's one analytical approach, not the only one, but I think it's one useful way to frame things, which is that you hold people by agent type constant, and then you vary the institutional environment within which that same agent is acting in, and you focus on the epistemic properties, so the knowledge generated by the institutional environment and the incentives that exist in that environment. And so all variation and explanations from this perspective can be attributed to the variation in institutions because we're holding agent type constant. That's not to say agent type is unimportant in the grand scheme of things. It's that to gain analytical traction, we're trying to hold certain aspects constant and vary others. So that's the idea behind it. So how does that apply to this conversation that we're entering now about what we call the surveillance state and surveillance capitalism? Well, we kind of begin by saying, look, the core premise or thesis is that data is collected in all settings. So there's data collection, and what varies is how that data is utilized. And that's going to be a function of the institutional differences in different settings. And in private, purely market settings, we call that surveillance capitalism, to stay consistent with the terminology that Zuboff uses and other people who are engaged in that literature. And then we call, in the political context, we call it the surveillance state. And then, of course, we lay out that dichotomy, but we recognize that there can be interplay between the two, which we can talk about later, meaning that the surveillance state can interact with surveillance capitalism, private firms collecting data, and they do. We know that historically. And so that's the foundation of it that kind of serves as our entry point. And then I think it's important to talk a little bit about what surveillance capitalism is. So what does that term mean? So maybe we can just spend a moment or two talking about that. And the way that Susanna Zuboff talks about it in her, I guess it's her book was first published in 2019, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, is the way she frames it is that surveillance capitalism is an entirely new economic system. So she says this is a new economic system that didn't exist prior. And it really emerged I think she locates it around the early 2000s. And I know you know this well, so jump in if I'm missing key parts. So it's around the early 2000s. And she said there was a dramatic shift in the nature of the economic system in America and elsewhere. And really that found its origins in what today many people call big tech. So you had Google, and then later Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and then a whole host of kind of third-party data brokers. And according to Zuboff, what these parties realized is that they could profit not just from collecting data to provide services directly to consumers. So I collect data as in the past, but I'm collecting that data to provide you with a superior product or service. But by collecting data, cultivating that data, and then selling it to third-party users. And so the data itself became the product. And that was kind of the new aspect of it. And she says, look, I recognize that when they collect this data, some of it they can use to improve their services, but much of it they don't. And she calls that differential behavioral surplus. The behavioral surplus is kind of that category of information that's collected that's not directly used to improve the consumer experience, but is sold to third parties. So that's the data aspect. And then what happens from there? Well, it doesn't end there. She says, look, they collect the data and then they're able to employ machine learning and artificial intelligence to cultivate predictions about how people will act. So I have all this data on you. I'm not using it to improve my services. I'm using it to predict what you're going to do. I can sell that to third parties who then can use it to engage in what she calls behavioral modification. I can actually change your behavior in ways that you otherwise wouldn't behave in order to benefit me, the third party who has access to data. And so from her perspective, this is ubiquitous because of the breadth of these technology companies. As she puts it in her book, all of our lives are connected to technology, even when we try to avoid it. It's not just kind of using your cell phone, but it's you shop online, you have a smart television, all of you have a smartwatch that's monitoring your health or the steps you take. And all of our, I think she refers to as kind of the life experience is being surveilled and cultivated and collected and used to shape our lives in ways that are weakening our agency and freedom as individuals who are supposed to be living in a free democratic society.
Yeah, definitely. And so, no, I think that's a really good sort of thorough accounting of it. And then also, I think it's kind of difficult because on the one hand, there's sort of various examples. So I think like the easiest thing that everybody's familiar with that comes to mind is targeted advertising. And so, and you all talk about this in your paper too. The way that targeted advertising is successful is less like creating new desires that weren't there or changing preferences, but being able to kind of target companies knowing they can target very specific users who have searched for a certain product and also have, some likely amount of disposable income, various other kind of factors that then means they can really target somebody who's already predisposed and likely to make a purchase rather than, creating or changing a preference. And same with let's say political ads too, of being able to find the people who are going to be most receptive to even a particular kind of messaging from a politician, or being able to target people who are on the fence about going out to vote. And this is by doing a negative ad or something, you can convince them not to go in at all and vote for the opposition or something like that. I think one thing that's difficult about this is that, I guess you can speak to this too. What's interesting is that in a lot of ways, Zuboff's critique and the critique of these sort of surveillance-based advertising are very reminiscent of other critiques of advertising. But then in another way, this really is, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think should we think of this sort of surveillance aspect of it in the sense of being able to collect enough data and find the individuals to target as being like a truly innovative form of advertising technology?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So first of all, let me try to take them in order. And we talk about this in our paper, at least from the economics perspective, the perspective of an economist. Many of the arguments that are advanced have a long history in the history of economic thought. And so there's two famous economists who level very famous critiques of advertising, Thorstein Veblen and John Kenneth Galbraith. And they, from their perspective, advertising served a couple of purposes. One was behavioral modification. Both of them believed that for-profit firms were manipulating the preferences of consumers for them to buy their product, and shaping those preferences in ways that would make citizens worse off. And Galbraith said that actually this undermined the argument for markets, because he said, look, the argument for markets is that markets satisfy the wants of consumers, but if they're creating the wants of consumers, they're not really satisfying things consumers want. They're satisfying artificially created demands. The other things, though, that they argued was that it contributed to monopoly power, that because advertising would create things like a brand, would, in addition to behavioral modification, would give incumbents a privileged position in the market against newcomers who didn't have that brand, didn't have, as you put it, kind of advertisements that resonated with people. And it was the equivalent of a barrier to entry, which reduced competition. And that led to a whole bunch of responses by economists throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s about the nature of advertising. And the way I view it, which is, and I've gotten pushback on this when I've talked about it. And even when we were writing the paper, there was a lot of back and forth among us as co-authors thinking about the unique aspects of what Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. My own position, I don't want to speak on, it's in the paper, so I think my co-authors agree with me, hopefully, is they've all read it and contributed to it. So I think that the uniqueness of this comes in the ability of the magnitude of the data that can be collected, and as you put it, the ability to target an advertisement. That's the unique aspect, but it's no different than in the past. And so what I mean by that is when I say it's no different, certainly it's different in form. So like walking past a billboard for shoes is different than me opening Facebook and saying, Chris, here's these type of shoes, this color, and they know I like that because I searched for it or bought something prior. So I get that there's that kind of difference, but it's no different in terms of what advertisers are trying to do. From an alternative perspective from the Veblen and Galbraith, is provide you information to get your attention, because there's competition for your hard-earned dollars, and they need to grab your attention and convince you to turn over your hard-earned dollars to them versus alternative uses of those dollars. And from that perspective, which kind of a number of economists pointed out, advertising is a form of reducing information asymmetries, of alerting you that a product or service is there as a consumer, of trying to convince you to buy it, but also of competition, because the very nature of it is competing. And many of the economists that wrote after Veblen and Galbraith flipped their logic over on their head and said, well, you're saying it's a source of monopoly power because it creates a brand, but in order to have competition, you have to be able to alert people that your product is there. So you say the incumbent is there, but my product's better. If you can't have advertising, you can't have that competitive aspect of alerting people of your product. And so from that standpoint, the kind of counter to that was that aspect of it. And the way we argue it in the paper is that these pop-up advertisements, these targeted advertisements, they might be annoying, but they're not harmful from a welfare standpoint, because no one's forcing you to buy stuff. And we cite some studies in there from marketing, from the field of marketing. And my reading of those studies goes something like this. If a targeted ad is something that aligns with your preferences already, then you are more likely on the margin. It's not a guarantee. So it's not like I show you a pop-up ad and then all of a sudden you become a zombie and just purchase stuff. It's like the strong form of the argument. On the margin, you're more likely to purchase the product or contribute to the cause. If it's completely opposite, or not, opposite's too strong of a word. If it's at odds with your underlying preferences, it's not like randomly you're going to do it. So if like you have strong preferences for environmental issues, if I show you a product that's environmentally friendly, on the margin, you're more likely to buy that product. But if I show you a product that is not environmentally friendly, it's not like magically I can shift your preferences and all of a sudden you're like, I no longer care about the environment. And so from that standpoint, is it bad or is it welfare reducing that I'm showing you a product that aligns with your concern about the environment? I don't know. So from my standpoint, providing consumers with more information compared to less is better. I think that's a preferable state of affairs in terms of providing consumers with more opportunity. But the other thing to always keep in mind, this comes back to what you and I were talking about earlier and links up with our prior discussion a bit, is if you move away from that, someone has to regulate it. And then you always have to start exploring the question of who's the regulator and how are they going to make decisions about how to regulate it and what to regulate. And for the reasons we talked about a little bit earlier, that is concerning to me when we start opening that door to those things. But you might have different thoughts or perspectives than the one I just laid out about the targeting advertiser and consumer welfare.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and this is something you guys touch on, which is that, well, and as you do touch on, it really is entangled with state forms of surveillance too. So a lot of this data that is collected might be innocuous, but some of it might not be and can be used in various ways, in criminal cases, all sorts of kind of concerns. And so it's also the question of, I think, if there's like a way around changing some of these things, it would not even necessarily, and we've talked about this before, I think, but and again, I think you guys do talk about this in the paper, but it's not even necessarily like regulatory action on ads, but something much broader about data and the sort of digital property rights. Now, these are also kind of difficult because all this data is very relational. So it's very difficult to say, I don't want any of my internet browsing data or anything to be collected about me. I don't want it to be accessed. But I can't really, even if I say that about my information, it can't be separated. I can't be separated out from other people's data if they are opting into things. So, so then there's sort of this, argument here that, and it still gets to what you're saying so the state is going to be the ones to enforce the property rights. But this goes into then this issues around institutional designs. But that's like what's interesting about Zuboff's book is that she does, or one of the things that I think is interesting is she'll talk about how there was sort of increased movement on online privacy, I guess, among regulators, among policymakers. But because of 9/11, the government lost like any incentive or interest in kind of pursuing that. So I guess this isn't really a question, but I guess sort of my concern, but that is sort of my concerns that even if we say finding the right people who want the right types of shoes isn't really a threat to their autonomy, there is this sort of bigger picture of, okay, how does digital life become this very legible, recordable way of living life? And as we increasingly live it this way, and then it's going to have huge impact on sort of our criminal justice system and things like that. Like, where are our constitutional restrictions come into play if this technology is enabling all this incredible data collection that could be accessed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a crucial set of points. So I'm glad you raised it. And certainly the property rights, and we mentioned this, but we don't say what the property rights regime should look like. Our point in the scheme of the comparative institutional framework is, as you vary property rights, it's going to, like anything, even in private markets. If I say if either it's legislated or emerges through some kind of common law process, and people say, you cannot collect data on Kristen and Chris on X, Y, and Z, then they can't do it, and that's going to influence things. But that does lead to interesting questions too about the surveillance state, then, which we really didn't talk about. And the way, which we talked about earlier, but the way my co-authors and I think about it is, again, data collection in itself is not inherently good or bad until you think about how it's used. And so when we talk about the surveillance state, we leverage James Buchanan's discussion of the productive and the predatory state. And so in principle, the state, government at any level, could use data collection to provide better public services. So we talk in the paper, for instance, about smart cities, where you could surveil people to collect people's usage, not to micro collect data on you personally, but just the number of people using a walkway or a roadway or whatever. And that can aid, and of course they do this already, that could aid in providing better services to people. In principle, we can't rule that out. But then you come up against the kind of stuff we were talking about earlier in the first part of our discussion about the surveillance state utilizing it to control people. Then you start thinking about interlinkages between private firms, because one of the things the Snowden revelations, of course, included was that government had either partnered with private firms and in some cases went behind their back and just tapped directly into their data centers. And then you have access to a whole host of information. And then this introduces the kind of issues you're raising about how it's used. That's separate than the criminal justice system. That's the national security state. But it does raise fascinating questions about this stuff and really hard questions. All that's to say, I don't have an answer to the really hard questions, but I guess that's what makes them interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I actually do also kind of have another kind of question, because something else from the Zuboff argument that's, again, it's kind of beyond the scope of the focus that you all are taking in the paper, but something that I've liked to talk about with my students, just because it's a very, so contracting and like contracting as a way of orienting ourselves in society. I mean, that's a very big part of the sort of freedom of contract is like a major economic freedom that I think is central to liberalism, and something that she argues in both the book, but then also the article that the book is based on. I think it's like kind of stands out more in the article is that what surveillance also, or this data surveillance is also enabling is things like insurance companies that can give discounts off of the data that they collect more thoroughly about your driving, and other kind of health insurance incentive programs and things like that. And so it's not just also sort of the advertising argument. It's also this argument over the way that we act as market agents, and also the way that we are kind of inviting different mechanisms, like disciplinary mechanisms, into our lives. But the argument that she makes isn't even really just about sort of the loss of autonomy. It's also the idea that we don't have the sort of flexibility within a contract to kind of enact our autonomy and also build social trust that we usually build in kind of commercial interactions, because there's this sort of incentive, like there's this sort of behavioralist, like incentive internalization that is kind of built into the technology as it exists, that you can kind of use surveillance to kind of change behavior. And that really is kind of a change on behavior rather than purely like you're going to do this anyway, and this is like just a little nudge in one direction or the other type of thing. So I guess this is sort of, again, it's broader, and we're kind of getting more into like political theory, but I'm a political theorist. I feel like I'm allowed to push in that direction. But I guess, do you think that is sort of a categorically different kind of issue? And I think also from like, Hayek's, that's very different from, I think, Hayek's response to Galbraith about advertising, or is it? I mean, is it just the sort of same kind of issue of, well, people kind of can voluntarily engage in these things or not. So that is the important distinction here between that and, again, the state type of action.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions. They're tough questions, and there's a couple ways you might think. The social trust one's fascinating. I have to think more about that, and I don't know, but I certainly see your point. I see your point, and that argument is a reasonable one, or that line of thinking is a reasonable one, meaning that it could affect not just relations in the present, but also how those relationships form and evolve in the future too. Meaning the surveillance aspect. On the insurance stuff, this is my economist is going to come out now. I view that a bit less of a concern, because one of the big issues with insurance is information asymmetries, which is why when you get life insurance, you fill out a form and you get a physical. Because they don't want to insure you for $2 million, and then you're jumping out of planes and smoking and all that stuff. Or when you buy homeowners insurance, they ask if you have kids in a trampoline in the backyard. Okay, so one way to view that as reducing information asymmetry, so that those people who are making moves, taking steps to take better care of themselves or be more responsible, are not incurring the cost of those that are not. And so from that standpoint, in terms of reducing information asymmetries, reducing what are called moral hazard problems, which is when you're insured against something, you act in more risky ways. might be a good thing. Might be problematic as well, but I think again that points to the difficulty, and I that's part of the point I like that you raised is that from an economic standpoint of information asymmetries, you could say okay, it shrinks those things, but maybe it has these other effects as well. As you and I were talking about earlier, a lot of this stuff is multifaceted, and so that's kind of interesting. On the Hayek point, in response to Galbraith, so for people who are listening that are unfamiliar, one of the things that Galbraith pointed out, and I brought this up earlier, it was referred to as this dependency effect or dependence effect, which is advertisers in Galbraith's kind of schema of things could make people dependent on their product. He did believe that corporations could make people, again, it's not like they're complete zombies, but they could strongly influence people to buy things that did not improve their welfare.
And it was like an argument against consumer sovereignty, essentially.
Yes, in his view, it flipped the argument of markets over. The argument for markets being that consumers drive the economic ship, if you will, because producers act at the whims of consumers. That was one of the main arguments for markets. Hayek came in a very short response and said, look, this makes no sense. It's in the Southern Economic Journal. It's like 2 or 3 pages. And he says, Galbraith's argument makes no sense. And Hayek's logic was that other than base needs, so, he says like eating, sex, he has like a couple kind of base needs that he lists. Everything we do is influenced by external messaging coming at us. And so we are, as human beings who are embedded in a whole host of social relationships and organizations, from the family to churches to broader society, we have stuff coming at us that's influencing us constantly in all aspects of life. And so that means that it's not just corporations to the extent that you have messaging coming at you that influence you, it's everything. And so Hayek says, look, of course, and Kenneth Boulding, who's another economist, he wrote a book called The Image, and he made a very similar argument. He didn't cite Hayek on this, but he says our image is the vision we have of ourselves, and it's very nuanced because we have kind of different identities depending on the context we're in, or images of ourselves. So we have an image of ourselves in relation to the nation, to our local community, to our family, to our church, to our friendships, to our colleagues. And like Hayek, Boulding said, he called them messages. He says there's messages hitting us constantly from all different angles. And he says most of them we just dismiss. Every once in a while, they affect who we are. They affect our image. But he says that's not just private advertisers. That's politics, that's religion, that's our friends and family, that's our significant others. And so all these things shape us as a person. And, we shouldn't deny that, but that's not a bad thing either. That kind of makes us who we are as human beings. And there's it kind of introduces the complexity of the multi-direction of the causality. So we can cause things. It's not that we have no agency, but also people influence us in life. And so that's kind of fascinating. So to the extent then surveillance capitalism is something special and unique, the argument has to be made that messaging somehow is having a dramatic effect on who we are as a person. And people can argue that. I mean, one of Zubov's arguments, as you know, is it undermines individual agency to live the life you want to live. And we talk about this in the paper. We say, yeah, we have to grant that point. And I think that's consistent with Boulding and with Hayek, that messaging influences us as a person. We're not atomistic. We don't live in isolation, and we don't live in a world where we control everything and no one has any influence on us.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it is interesting because this is also me just speaking on my working paper that's on the similar stuff, but I would imagine that there might be some economists who, see the debates around the sort of surveillance capitalism and Shoshana Zuboff and are really willing to kind of dismiss it, especially because I don't know, again, I love everybody, all of our colleagues, everybody's very supportive of me as a non-economist, but I also think, there can be some people who are kind of outsiders who don't have, it's almost like you don't speak the language entirely, right? Can kind of be seen as, well, they just don't really get how the economy, like how economics really works or what we even really do and what we're studying, what we're arguing. But what I think is interesting, though, is that Zuboff, she seems to be, or at least how I read her, is that there's this attempt to engage she talks about having studied with Milton Friedman, and she cites Smith and Hayek, in which she's kind of trying to argue that, look, all these things I'm concerned with autonomy are actually consistent in some way with the political theory of kind of how the free market is supposed to protect liberties from Smith and from Hayek. And so I think it's like an interesting attempt to kind of bridge dialogue, even as somebody might think, oh, well, she's just another person focused on quote unquote neoliberalism or something. So I guess I'd also just kind of ask you, what do you think of sort of engaging, kind of back to where we started, these interdisciplinary debates around things like digital media and the sort of ethics and politics of digital technologies when it relates to surveillance? Are there kind of things that we need to keep in mind as we try to create this interdisciplinary dialogue? Are we, I don't know, like what's sort of the skills that you bring to bear in trying to do this kind of work and listen and, take to heart arguments from others while also kind of refuting them in your way?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm glad you brought up your working paper. I almost mentioned it before, but then I didn't know if that you wanted it mentioned, so I
it's okay.
didn't mention it. So, but people should check it out if you want them, if it's available to check out. But you've written on the Zuboff stuff from what I think is a fascinating perspective from Hayek and this issue of agency, which again we cited at the end of our paper because it influenced our thinking on how we tried to wrestle with some of these issues of weak agency. Because I do think there's certainly something there that deserves engagement. And of course, we think the idea does because we are writing this paper and we tried our best, and I hope I succeeded with my co-authors to strongman the argument, to present Zuboff's argument, because of course it is, and we have presented this in numerous settings with economists, and you are right that certainly some are quite dismissive, but others, by the way, I think because of perhaps like the rise of behavioral economics, are somewhat open to it too, of the idea of that people can be influenced, if not outright manipulated, by various forces, whether it's political forces or market forces. But in any case, from my perspective, it certainly deserves engagement. And whether people coming from the side of surveillance capitalism find our arguments convincing or not is up to them, of course, but it's our own thinking through it at this point. But how do I, your point's a good one. How do we kind of think through things? I think number one's it kind of sounds mundane and cliche, but I think it's important, is to recognize other disciplines, recognize them as having something to say, and then trying to the best of our ability to appreciate what they have to say. Which again sounds somewhat mundane, but I think too often, it's not just economists, by the way, I think in general, because I've been in other settings where people are dismissive of economics or kind of strawman economics, like, oh, you all believe that people are kind of atomistic or that markets are efficient or markets can solve all our problems. But I'm very fortunate, and you're part of the same program and initiatives I am here at the Hayek program, but I'm fortunate to be in a very highly interdisciplinary environment. And at the outset, you talked about where you and I first met as part of the Adam Smith Fellowship. One of the reasons I really appreciate that program is because of the interdisciplinary environment that it puts me in. So as part of those programs and engaging with the fellows and scholars from different fields, it's really made me better, I think, as a thinker, because not only have I read the same kind of category of readings in the Austrian tradition, the Virginia political economy and Blooming tradition, now probably dozens of times over and over, which I always pick up new things. But you sit around this table, and it is a minority now, the way our program has evolved, a minority of the participants are economists now. And so, and being a scholar at the table, and I'm usually in the role as discussion leader, which I know you do a lot of as well, because I'm not an active participant as a scholar engaging in the conversation directly, I can listen to people. So, people say stuff, and I'm like, oh, I actually never thought about that. Or they'll say things or they'll reference things. And, from that perspective, it's made me think of things that I haven't thought of, but also the perhaps best part is it's pointed out gaps in my own thinking, but the thinking in the thinkers that I value, because you recognize those gaps, but those gaps are kind of intellectual profit opportunities, if you want to think about it that way, because it's opportunity to kind of think about, all right, like here are the weaknesses of this thinker or this framework or this position, and what would a response be to that? Or maybe there's not a response. Maybe that's a flaw in that, or a big gap that we can't address, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I also think it does, I sort of try to always steel man even arguments that I'm really like disagree with or am attempting to refute because, but also not, I guess I just think that like times that I've read certain works that I am otherwise pretty in agreement with, like I already, find compelling. Whenever there's sort of a straw manning thing going on, it always frustrates me. And I guess maybe I don't know if it's because I'm somebody who is always into interdisciplinary work because I'm always into like kind of trying to figure out disagreement or reconcile disagreement. But it just seems to me like sort of there are a lot of skills and almost attitudinal habits that we have to have as academics to actually be able to speak to a lot of different audiences and also know that we're going to be kind of understood by different audiences. And just because it always is a dialogue, you're never going to be having a conversation alone. And trying to navigate that is I think one of the major challenges, but also one of the more fulfilling aspects of scholarship, but also, and again, why I really do value the time that we have in those kind of fellowship discussion seminars with so many different people of so many different perspectives and expertise too. And it's really rewarding. And also the value of having these conversations on the podcast. I'm really lucky to have all that too. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I want to start this recap of the episode with a quote that Chris referenced from the Church Committee's report. This quote comes from Book 2 of the final report, which was titled Intelligence Activities and the Rights of Americans. So the Church Committee wrote, "We have seen segments of our government in their attitudes and action adopt tactics unworthy of a democracy and occasionally reminiscent of the tactics of totalitarian regimes. As much as we aspire to certain ideals, as a community, I think every political community has to have certain ideals and expectations, what we hope for from each other and from the state. And what is challenging is as we say things like, oh, this is something that an authoritarian regime would do, not a liberal democracy, as sort of a rhetorical pronouncement of a condemnation. We also have to have historical perspective, a sense of the inequalities and the injustices that exist today, that have existed throughout history, and how even liberal democracies do not live up to their own ideals in practice. So that line that Chris referenced is, I think, really important when we think about surveillance in various ways. But it's also something that's important when we think about politics and the political economy more broadly, and the relationship we have between the ideals we hope for, the expectations we have, versus having that critical perspective that allows us to recognize really dark parts of our history and our current politics. So to recap some of the specific insights that Chris shared with us and that we talked about today. First, I want to highlight that a lot of our conversation, especially about the history of intelligence services in the U.S. relating to surveillance, comes from Chris and Abigail Hall's book, Tyranny Comes Home, The Domestic Fate of U.S. Militarism. This talks about all sorts of parts of the American occupation of the Philippines and its repercussions for domestic liberties in the U.S. So Tyranny Comes Home is specifically focused on the boomerang effect and the notion that foreign interventions, occupations by foreign countries like the U.S. in the Philippines can end up having a boomerang effect where tools of social control, policies of social control, practices, forms of institutions and governance that the occupier develops, hones, applies to foreign populations end up coming back like a boomerang into affecting the domestic liberties of citizens. So that isn't to say that there aren't also, of course, horrific histories and injustices that happen through occupation, through military intervention to the people who are under occupation, but rather it's a direct refutation of the very common rhetoric we've heard, particularly in US foreign policy, but it's not unique to the US. This idea that we need to go to war, we need to pursue militaristic interventions in order to protect our liberties, to protect American values, in order to even bring democracy to other people. Now, Chris's work with Abigail Hall in this book is a really great kind of targeted response to that rhetoric, those ideas, those assumptions that I think people can end up having without even necessarily realizing it. It shows that in actuality, throughout our history, we can see that these interventions abroad have ended up undermining domestic liberties at home rather than protecting them. And finally, we end our conversation by discussing surveillance capitalism. This is a concept coined by Shoshana Zuboff to discuss how companies, especially digital technology companies, are able to collect data about users, and rather than just using this data to improve their products and services, they make money through this data. So that doesn't necessarily mean they sell the data, but it might mean something like they promise clients, digital advertisers, for example, in the context of most social media platforms, they'll promise digital advertisers access to individuals who are most susceptible to their advertising, to the products and messages they want to sell. And the idea there is that the company will use the data it's collected about their users to kind of seek and target the individuals that will be likely to be purchasers of a product, or again, voters of a politician, if it's a political ad. So Chris and his co-authors use comparative institutional analysis to juxtapose surveillance in the market context and surveillance in state context. And as he argued in our conversation, there's an important voluntary element in the market context that ultimately when a person decides what product to buy or what politician to vote for, they are importantly making their own decision. They are choosing to act, and that action is not guaranteed by advertisers' efforts. This is actually very reminiscent of Hayek's arguments regarding propaganda in a totalitarian versus a market society in his arguments on the road to serfdom, and something that he draws on in his response to John Kenneth Galbraith that we discussed a little bit in episode 2. And overall, what this argument is that a monopoly on information, a monopoly on the worldviews and messages that people are able to access, like in a totalitarian regime, is the real problem that would reduce autonomy and reduce political possibilities in a society. And that fundamentally, even in other societies, non-totalitarian societies, or we might like to say liberal democracies, there might still be government propaganda. But what is essential is that there are other actors who are able to spread messages and ideas. And when it comes down to even ads and messages from private actors, what's important is they aren't the only ones on the scene. There's peers, we affect each other. There are various actors who impact the messages, the worldviews that we are encountering. And I think that is an important insight, and I appreciate it, but I will admit that I am concerned with leaving the conversation there. Our conversation focused on how targeted digital advertising shapes consumer choices, but there are plenty of other examples of massive data collection with clear political and personal implications. So I wanted to mention a couple, one from digital advertising and one from healthcare. First, let's consider the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where Facebook, which is now called Meta, allowed a third party, Cambridge Analytica, to use a psychology questionnaire to collect vast data of not only the users who consented to the quiz, but their friends. You may have heard about this because the company claimed that its analytics, Cambridge Analytica, claimed that its analytics helped Trump target voters with personalized messaging to win in the 2016 election. Recently, there was also a major hack of users' DNA profiles held by 23andMe. Hackers used this leaked genetic data to compile a database of individuals with Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, making them susceptible to targeting from hate groups. While these scandals relate to very different kinds of private data collection, both show how data are relational and networked. So when your friend or relative consents to data collection, that will impact your privacy, whether you like it or not. DNA companies like 23andMe are not subject to America's existing healthcare regulations, which are designed to protect privacy and what I think is a really important value, autonomy. Personally, I think individual autonomy can be itself networked, shaped by our relations with others, our political structures as well. When we feel powerless to understand and control how data about us have been collected and how such data have been used to shape our decisions, big and small, and who gets to profit from that, that is the feeling of our autonomy being violated, threatened. And that's what I think makes personalized digital advertising and the broader digital political economy of which it is a part unique from earlier forms of backlash against advertising. These are big questions and big issues that we will continue to dive into throughout this season. Thanks for joining us. Till next time.